Hi everyone, and welcome to Crime Alley Documentaries. Today, we're talking about one of the most haunting cases of workplace stalking in American history, a case that led to critical changes in stalking and harassment laws. This is the story of Laura Black and Richard Farley, a story of obsession, violence, and survival. Some of the content in this episode is disturbing and might not be suitable for all listeners, so please take caution as we dive into this case. Richard Wade Farley was born in Texas on July 25, 1948. He was the oldest of 6 siblings, and his father was in the military, which meant that they had to relocate frequently. But they eventually settled in California. After graduating high school and college, Richard joined the U.S. Army and followed in his father's footsteps. He remained in the Army for 10 years and was discharged in 1977. Then he landed a job as a software technician at ESL, a defense contractor in Sunnyvale, California. Everything was going well for Richard. He was considered an extremely talented, intelligent, and valued employee of the company and had high security clearance. After all, he'd been working there for 5 years, and he seemed to live a normal, uneventful, and happy life, although he was socially awkward and known for being eccentric. But in April 1984, things would change for the 39-year-old Richard Farley. Laura Black was a bright young engineer who in April of 1984 was just beginning her career at ESL. She was 22 years old, smart, ambitious, and excited to make her mark in a male-dominated field. Richard was introduced to Laura on her very first day by a supervisor. He was instantly infatuated with her. This was the kind of love at first sight you see in movies. From day one, Richard was crazy over her and started doing everything in his power to get her attention. Richard was not a ladies' man. Sure, he'd had girlfriends in the past, but he was never the guy with the smooth game. At first, he started showing up at her office and desk with homemade baked goods. Laura just thought he was being friendly and this was his way of welcoming her to the company, so she didn't mind the constant visits by the friendly face. Sure, as a woman, she felt uncomfortable at times, but it was nothing concerning. He was sweet. Although he did start asking her out constantly, and every single time, the good-natured, sweet, and polite Laura gently rejected him. She didn't want to be rude, and had no reason to be anything but polite to him. But after a while, he started giving her gifts. Laura started getting a little uneasy about the gifts, because they weren't the only thing Richard was leaving on her desk. He also gave her love letters in which he kept claiming that they were meant to be, and one way or another, they would end up together. Laura just couldn't see it yet. Still, Laura tried to keep calm and simply reject his advances, but his obsession with her was bordering on crazy and was escalating each time they saw each other. He constantly showed up at her office, lingered in common areas to catch a glimpse of her, and started conversations that seemed to have no point and go nowhere. Yeah, it all seemed harmless at first, but something all girls out there can back me up on is that harmless doesn't always stay harmless. And as a woman, you get the vibes. She tried to politely distance herself, hoping he would lose interest. But Richard took this as encouragement rather than a sign to back off. Over the next few months, Richard started following her around in his car. He even showed up at her house. And in case you're wondering, no, Laura didn't give him her address. What happened was, Richard went through her personal files under false pretenses and by befriending the custodial staff. He even made copies of the keys to her desk and her files at work to get a glimpse into what her life looked like, a life he believed someday he would be part of. Things just got worse and worse for Laura. By this time, he had even gone as far as joining her aerobics classes to be close to her, which, as you can imagine, was very unsettling after all the time she had rejected him. But he never stopped asking her out. In one instance, he even told her that he would continue to ask her out until she accepted or until the day he died. Laura had to move 4 times in 4 years just to feel safe, but he found her address every single time. He would out of nowhere show up at her house and take pictures of her while she was taking out trash or getting her mail. He wrote her letters 1 or 2 times a week and doctored photos of him with Laura being together on a date. And this was not for his eyes only. The guy actually mailed the photos to her. Can you imagine how creepy that is? To receive photos of yourself with a guy you've moved 4 times to hide from. That's just insane. He imagined a relationship that didn't exist, weaving a fantasy that Laura had no part in. He began calling her incessantly, demanding she go out with him, and even proposed marriage. She later recounted that his letters went from begging for her attention to outright threatening her life if she didn't reciprocate his feelings. This was beyond unwelcome. Laura had made it clear multiple times that she was not interested, but Richard's obsession left him convinced that he just needed to win her over. His mindset wasn't just unsettling, it was dangerous. Eventually, Laura sought help from ESL's Human Resources Department. At that time, workplace harassment policies were almost non-existent, and ESL's hands were tied in terms of what they could legally do. They warned Richard multiple times, even suspending him briefly, but he returned each time undeterred. They eventually sent him to mandatory counseling sessions, which he attended, but still wouldn't stay away from Laura. He seemed to believe he had a right to control her life. Feeling increasingly terrified, Laura took the step of filing a restraining order against Richard in early 1988. She was hoping this legal barrier would finally force him to stay away, but Richard saw this as a betrayal, and it became a turning point in his downward spiral. He was eventually fired from the company in 1986 after 9 years of working for them, and found a job at a rival company. In one of his letters, he wrote, quote, "Once I'm fired, you won't be able to control me ever again. Pretty soon, I'll crack under the pressure and run amok and destroy everything in my path. You cost me a job, $40,000 in equity taxes I can't pay, and a foreclosure. Yet, I still like you. Why do you want to find out how far I'll go?" Closing his letter, threatening Laura again, quote, "I absolutely would not be pushed around, and I'm beginning to get tired of being nice," end quote. He was experiencing economic hardships, lost 2 houses, and found himself in trouble with the IRS for back taxes. But none of it seemed to matter to him. He thought constantly about Laura and increased his efforts to gain her affection. But as you can already tell, this was not the end of his obsession just because he didn't work at the same company as her. On February 9, 1988, after the restraining order was served, he sent a package to Laura's attorney claiming to have evidence that he and Laura had a long-lasting relationship. The package included photographs of them together on dates, which he had made, a garage door opener to her house, and hotel and credit card receipts. But her attorney dismissed the package as fabrication. This was the last straw. Richard, having always been a gun enthusiast, started buying more guns and ammunition. On February 16, 1988, the day before Laura's restraining order hearing, Richard showed up at ESL with a chilling plan. He was heavily armed, carrying a shotgun, a semi-automatic rifle, 2 pistols, and an arsenal of ammunition. He parked the motorhome he had recently purchased in the parking lot of ESL and waited for Laura to leave work. But at about 2:50 p.m., he loaded up his guns, a foot-long knife, smoke bombs, wore a bulletproof vest, earplugs, and a leather glove. He entered the ESL offices around 3 p.m. and began his rampage. He fatally shot Lawrence Kane, 46, in the parking lot as he was leaving the building, then turned and fired at Randall Hemingway, but he ducked behind his car. He entered a side door by shooting through the glass. He then killed a man behind his desk in the lobby and entered the stairwell where another victim was killed. On the second floor, as he was making his way to Laura's second-floor office, he murdered 2 men and 2 women. He shot incessantly, killing 7 employees and wounding 4 others. Richard made his way through the building, leaving chaos and fear in his wake. Laura, who by this point had heard the shots and was hiding in her office, slammed the door of her office in his face, trying to keep him from entering. But he fired a shotgun round through the door, hitting her in the left shoulder and collapsing a lung. She fell unconscious and Richard moved on. At 3:15 p.m., he called the emergency services and said, quote, "I'm the one who's been wasting people," end quote. Police SWAT team showed up and Richard kept moving from one room to another to avoid being shot by the sniper. He told the negotiator that he wanted to, quote, "gloat a little bit," end quote, and that he had enough ammunition to last 2 hours if he fired continuously. And get this, apparently he had taken out a life insurance policy on himself and had cited Laura as his beneficiary, and told the negotiator that he wasn't planning on leaving the building alive, and he changed the beneficiary from Laura to his new girlfriend, Mei Chang. Meanwhile, Laura regained consciousness and managed to patch up her wound to stop herself from bleeding out. Moving through the building to avoid Richard, Laura ran into other colleagues who were hiding out in the building, and they eventually escaped. The massacre continued for hours. Police were called to the scene and a standoff began. Richard barricaded himself inside the building, seemingly indifferent to the horror he had caused. Finally, after 5 hours at around 8:30 p.m., he finally surrendered to the police after requesting a sandwich and a soft drink. The aftermath of this tragedy was devastating. 98 rounds were fired, 7 innocent lives were lost, and countless families were forever changed. Laura, who suffered critical injuries, faced a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. Richard Farley was arrested, and in his trial showed little remorse for his actions. He was ultimately convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But Laura's story didn't end there. Her bravery and survival became a catalyst for legal change. She worked with lawmakers to push for anti-stalking laws that would protect victims from harassment in the future. This case led directly to California's first anti-stalking law in 1990, which allowed victims to obtain restraining orders even when the stalker was not a domestic partner. Laura's fight for justice had lasting impacts. California's anti-stalking law became a model for other states, and eventually, federal stalking laws followed. This case raised awareness that workplace harassment could have fatal consequences and prompted companies to establish stronger policies for employee safety. Laura Black's story is one of resilience in the face of unimaginable terror. She survived something that no one should ever have to face and transformed her trauma into a force for change. She got her last letter from Richard while he was sitting in prison, which expressed that she had finally won. This would be the 200th letter that she had received from him over the span of the 4 years of terror she had endured. This case also serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers of obsession and the importance of addressing mental health issues before they lead to tragedy. Richard's fixation went unchecked for years, and his spiral could have been interrupted with the right support and intervention. As difficult as these cases are, they're important to remember. They remind us that we still have work to do in protecting people from harassment and violence, and that no one should feel unsafe in their workplace or community. Thank you for joining us on Crime Alley Documentaries. If you or someone you know is experiencing harassment or stalking, please reach out for help. There are resources available, and no one should have to face this alone. Stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you next time with another story that sheds light on the complexities of the human psyche and the consequences of unchecked obsession. Please leave any theories or comments you might have for us down below. We're really interested to know what you think about this case.